their civil engineering group. And our special guests tonight are Mr. Chris Rust and Mr. John Lyons, who's speaking to you in a few moments about all the research you see on the boards around you, and they will have a presentation for you. I also want to thank many of you because you got the survey in the mail and you drew on your little drawings of where you had watering your lawns. We do appreciate that greatly. That gave us a lot of additional information we needed for the study. Also, many of you may have saw last about October, November, you may have seen a man walking through your backyard with a survey rod. Actually, with a GIS person on behalf of this company getting GPS data. And they literally walked from the Great Miami River all the way up to DeWeese Road where the Great Kidder Ditch begins, getting information about the flow of the water, the width of the ditch, the condition of the ditch, and so forth. So I don't want to, you're not here to listen to me. You're here to listen to these fine gentlemen. So what I'm going to do is step aside. Just so you know, as a point of interest, the restrooms are right outside these doors here, right in this corridor, if you need to walk over there at some point in time this evening. And there will be a chance for more discussion and walking and discussing things with these gentlemen when this meeting concludes. There will be a PowerPoint presentation as we get started to give you an update on what we've learned so far. And with that, I will bow out to Mr. Chris Rust.
Thank you, Stan. Well, appreciate everyone coming out to participate in the discussion tonight. The presentation we have here is an overview of where we are at with the current drainage study. As Stan had mentioned, one of the parts of this drainage study was soliciting feedback from you all several months ago as we got started on the drainage study. The presentation today isn't necessarily a final conclusion on where we're at with the drainage study. It's more of an update on what our initial findings are. And as Stan mentioned, we do welcome your feedback at any point during this presentation, and then afterwards a question and answer session. So the agenda we have today for the meeting, we're going to talk about what the purpose of the drainage study is, what the limits of the study are. We do want to have a discussion about easements along Kidder Ditch. We've got a series of maps here that show some of the easements along the ditch. We did want to provide an update on what the responses were as part of that survey and outreach to you all. We do want to talk about our stormwater modeling efforts. So the boards over here, we'll touch upon how we got to the conclusion that we're showing on some of the maps here, some of the preliminary findings of the drainage study, and then ultimately the next steps as part of the study. So the purpose of the drainage study, we've got pictures of flooding here. Some of these came from the city, some of these came from you all as part of our outreach efforts. It seems like the primary issue that is being dealt with throughout the watershed along the ditch is flooding issues. So some of the pictures here, I believe the picture on the top left is the bridge at Maple Crest Drive, which has been prone to overtopping on several occasions. Picture on the top right, some of the flooding along the streets that happens during severe rainfall events. And then along the ditch itself, the bottom two pictures as that water comes up in the ditch, how it does extend out into the yards and then recedes after the rainfall event. So the primary focus of our drainage study really is evaluating the flooding conditions along the ditch itself. So the limits of the study, this map went out, I think, as part of the invitation to this meeting that just show the limits of the study. So on the map here, Kidder Ditch flows in a southern direction. Our study went all the way up to DeWeese Road to the north, all the way down to Staunton Road to the south. So the pictures here on this slide show some example photos of what the ditch looks like, both at the upstream end and then as you work your way to the downstream end. So kind of towards the upper reaches of the watershed, it's a very small ditch, but then when you get all the way down towards Staunton Road, much bigger, wider, broad ditch. And along those same lines, just the different types of characteristics of the ditch, you know, as we've done this evaluation and done our site visits here, there's different characteristics of the ditch as you work your way from upstream to downstream. So again, this is towards the downstream end, a much kind of bigger, wide ditch. Some portions of the ditch have a concrete lined bottom that conveys the flow during those smaller events. And then other pictures here that just show some of the vegetation and growth along the ditch. But each of those different segments of the ditch, depending upon that characteristic, does change how much flow goes through the ditch. That's part of the study, was incorporating that information of the ditch itself. So one of the things that was evident, as Stan mentioned, we had a surveyor out in the field collecting a lot of topographic data, cross sections along the ditch throughout the whole limits of the study. Portions of this ditch are extremely flat, as I'm sure you all are aware if you live next to the ditch. But in this particular case, what we're showing here between Market Street and Maple Crest, the elevation of the ditch itself really only drops about 1 foot over about 1,000 feet of length. That amounts to a 0.1% slope. So from an engineering standpoint, when you're talking about a very, very flat slope, it's just a little bit more challenging for that water to be conveyed in the slope, when normally we're looking for something with maybe a 0.5% or a 1% slope to get the flow moving a little bit quicker. So that is a constraint throughout this ditch, is just the flat topography that really sometimes limits the amount of conveyance during some rainfall events. We also took note of all of the bridges and culverts along Kidder Ditch. So within the limits of our study, there are 8 bridges. I would call most of them bridges instead of culverts, but there's 8 specific bridges that we took specific measurements on as part of the study and incorporated into our evaluation. So just pictures, we thought it'd be helpful for everyone to see pictures of these bridges, just in case you're not familiar with how certain portions of this ditch look. But again, kind of working our way up downstream to upstream, Staunton Road at the downstream end, going up to Stony Ridge Avenue, Skylark Drive, and Terry Drive. So as part of our evaluation, as we mentioned, having someone in the field collecting survey data, we took detailed measurements on all of these bridges and accounted for that in our stormwater modeling of the watershed. These tend to be important because, as the flow from the channel comes in, it does get restricted a little bit as it comes into the bridge or underneath the bridge and then expands out. And one thing that was evident in some of these bridges, particularly Maple Crest Drive, just the amount of clearance below the bottom of the bridge and the ditch is pretty small. In some cases, it's only 2 or 3 feet, where normally you'd want to see a little bit more kind of depth below the bridge to get more flow through it. So again, taking these measurements in the field and incorporating this into the model, which we'll talk about here shortly, was a key component of our evaluation. So easements along the ditch, one of the things that we did as part of this effort was research existing drainage easements along the ditch. And I understand, obviously, this is kind of a broad map of the watershed, but we have more zoomed in maps over here that we can take a look at after the presentation that show specific locations of where there's a drainage easement along the ditch. In some cases, that drainage easement and downstream end is as wide as about 100 feet. And other locations that easement width is about 40 or 50 feet wide. So we thought it would be important to document the location of the drainage easement, just so everyone is aware that there are easements along the ditch on either side of it. So this is more of a zoomed in image that shows, some of those easement lines in relation to the ditch itself. In some locations, that easement width is 20 or 30 feet off of a property line. So again, the maximum total width of that easement may be 50 feet in some locations. Interestingly enough, some of the things we did note, though, there are some restrictions within the easements, whether it's sheds, playgrounds, other things like that, that really, are currently within the drainage easement that tend to kind of be in the way when there is drainage coming through the easement, where some of the language from the easements does restrict any sort of structures or anything like that within the drainage easement. So we did want to mention that as part of this. And again, we've got the maps to show the easement lines, and we can have some site specific discussions about those easements as well. So one of the key parts of our evaluation was the resident survey. Hopefully everyone in the room received that survey back in, I think, January timeframe, January or February timeframe. We did have some specific questions in that survey that really helped inform our drainage evaluation. We did also include a map of everyone's parcel as part of that for you all to mark up, how high you've ever seen the water get on your specific property. And we've got some more information on that here shortly, and why that was important. So that survey went out to about 170 residents along Kidder Ditch. So again, anyone between Staunton Road all the way up towards Deweese Road, if you have a parcel or a property that is immediately adjacent to the ditch, you should have gotten a survey as part of this. So that went out to about 170 individual property owners. We did get right around 70 responses back. So, again, thank you everyone who did respond to that, because it was important for our evaluation. Quite frankly, the response was better than what we typically see when we do these types of studies. So I think it's a testament to you all that, you are, engaged in this process. So out of, one of the first questions we had in the survey, have you ever experienced, flooding issues on your property? So of the 70 responses, 47 of the responses said no to that question. 23 of the respondents answered yes to that question. So we've color coded the map here. Any properties in blue, which kind of are clustered right through here, or the ones that maybe were more apt to respond yes to that question related to flooding issues. And we'll drill down here in a minute. So of those 23, this is kind of more a zoomed in map of where we saw those responses. The majority of the type of flooding that was acknowledged in that survey was more yard flooding. So in other words, you get a rainfall event, the water comes up from the ditch, extends a little bit beyond maybe the banks of the ditch and gets into your yard. And then after the rainfall event, recedes back into the ditch. However, there were a few respondents that did acknowledge basement related flooding. So some of those properties there highlighted in orange, and that cluster primarily between Scenic and Cloverdale were where we've received responses of more, primary structure related flooding that tended to be more kind of groundwater seepage related, as opposed to overland flooding that impacted the house. So the extent of flooding, these are just some example screenshots of those survey results where, very specific information was provided where you show, this is how high we've seen the water get on our property. And that is a very important piece in our evaluation when we calibrate these stormwater models to really understand, what is going on in reality from the responses that we got from the residents. So what we did with that information, more in a graphical format, is take all of that information and create this map that shows, based on the responses, how high have the residents ever seen the water get during any rainfall event. And again, this is a very important piece of information, and we'll get more information here. I'll explain in a little bit more detail here shortly. So the May 2014 rainfall event, this was another critical question on that survey. One of the things that we had heard from the city was, there was this big rainfall event back in 2014, May of 2014. Portions of the interstate had to be shut down because there was so much rain during that rainfall event. You see some quotes here from ODOT, categorizing this as a 1,000-year rainfall event because there was so much rain. So parts of the interstate were shut down, both north and south of the city. So we felt like this was a key question to ask, knowing that this was a pretty significant event. What sort of issues did you experience during that event? Was there any sort of primary structure related flooding as part of that? One of the pieces of information that we evaluate when we do these studies, we do go back and look at the rainfall data that happened during these rainfall events. So this is obviously kind of a colorful map here, but this is radar data from that particular event back in May of 2014. We do tend to use this data maybe a little bit more frequently than just one single rain gauge that may pick up rainfall at one location, but doesn't necessarily tell you how much rainfall fell over a broad area. So on this map, the black boundary here is the city of Troy boundary. The color coding of the map, basically any areas where you see red or orange on this map, there was anywhere between 5 and 7 inches of rainfall that fell during that event, and basically a 3 to 4 hour period. So you can see very kind of intense part of that rainfall event is essentially cut right through the city. And that's part of the reason some of the interstates had to be closed, because of the amount of rainfall. So as it relates to Kidder Ditch, this is the boundary of Kidder Ditch here, and here's the ditch itself. So within the Kidder Ditch watershed, about 4 to 6 inches of rainfall fell during that event in approximately 3 hours. So again, a very intense, short duration event. And when we look at kind of the spectrum of rainfall events, when we evaluate that amount of rainfall and that duration, that event really was kind of off the charts, so to speak. So from an engineering standpoint, we tend to think of things in these rainfall events of a 1-year event or a 10-year event or a 100-year event. I did want to clarify when we make those kind of statements, a 100-year event, sometimes it can get confusing. You may think, well, that's an event that should happen once every 100 years. We look at it more from a probability standpoint. A 100-year event has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. And a 10-year event, for example, has a 10% chance of happening in any given year. So this spectrum here shows rainfall depths for a 3-hour duration. So if we were to categorize something as a 1-year event, you're looking at about 1.4 inches of rain in 3 hours. 25-year event, close to 3 inches of rain in 3 hours. This March 2014 event got well over 4 inches of rain, which is even beyond a 100-year event. So some of the photos we got, and again, this was maybe a combination of photos from the city and photos from you all, looking at that rainfall event. So right now we're kind of near the Market Street Bridge. You see the church upstream from the bridge. There's flooding going on just upstream from the bridge, extending just in front of the church, but no evidence or no documentation of actual flooding of the building itself. Market Street here, you can see how much flow is going on immediately downstream of the bridge. We're not always sure when we get these photos if you're really looking at the maximum peak of when that water got up the highest during the event, but we felt like these were probably pretty close to being towards that most intense part of the event when we look at how high the water got. So the Maple Crest Drive Bridge in this particular event, obviously it did overtop. So Maple Crest Bridge was the one we showed the picture of where there's only a couple feet of clearance below the bridge. I know we heard a lot of responses related to this particular bridge, and some of you all that live upstream from the bridge, where there tends to be a little bit more frequent blockage of debris. We know the city put in kind of a trash rack structure immediately upstream from the bridge to try to keep that debris from getting collected underneath the bridge. But that does tend to result occasionally in these really intense rainfall events of water overtopping that bridge. And then immediately upstream, again, you can see how high the water gets, adjacent to the properties, just upstream from that bridge during this event. The Terry Drive Bridge and Skylark Drive Bridge, these pictures show the water getting really close to the top of the road, not quite overtopping the road. Some of you all may have some more pictures during this event that show it overtopping the road, but according to the pictures we have here, it got really close to the overtopping the bridge during the event. Stony Ridge Avenue near Market Street, there was flooding in some portions of the street here, maybe several inches to a foot of water on the street itself. Stony Ridge Avenue down at Carriage Drive, flooding out on the street as well. So sometimes this can be a symptom of just too much water in the ditch itself, but sometimes when you see street flooding, and I think we saw this in some of the responses from you all, it can be more of a symptom of just there's too much flow on the street, and the inlets and storm sewers out on the street can't convey that flow fast enough. So it tends to be a little bit of a combination of maybe too much flow in the ditch, but then also too much flow on the street itself has a hard time getting into the storm infrastructure system. So in summary on that particular event in May of 2014, out of the responses we've got from a structural flooding standpoint, 39 of the respondents said no to the question whether or not you had structural flooding, and only 3 responded yes to the question about structural flooding, again, kind of in that scenic court area. So the general outcome we saw from this particular event, a very significant rainfall event, yet not a lot of widespread flooding of houses or structures themselves. So when we talk about these different rainfall events, the industry standard for stormwater management, there's different components of the stormwater conveyance system, whether it's the storm sewers or piping network, the open channel system, detention or retention basins. Those are typically designed and sized according to these different rainfall events. So typically a storm sewer system is designed to convey a 10-year event, and you check it for a 25-year event to make sure there's not widespread flooding. Same thing with an open channel system. Detention and retention basins tend to be designed for bigger up to 100-year rainfall events. So, this is kind of the industry standard when it comes to sizing and designing these types of stormwater conveyance systems. So, quite frankly, when we get these rainfall events that may exceed a 100-year event, a lot of these conveyance systems weren't really designed to convey anything that large. And it can be challenging to do that because it gets very costly to put in really large storm sewers and really large conveyance systems for those really extreme rainfall events. So other drainage issues, we also had a question on the survey about, have you experienced just other drainage issues? And we'll touch upon those here in a minute, but 54 out of the 70 respondents answered no to the question. 16 respondents answered yes. Some of those comments related to that question were tied towards, maybe some erosion in the ditch on your property, maybe some collection of debris. Once you get a rainfall event, there's some debris coming from the ditch that drainage subsides in the ditch, but then you're left with some debris on the property itself. Localized street flooding, we showed the pictures of that. And then there were several comments about flood insurance, which we'll touch upon here in a minute as well. So Kidder Ditch stormwater modeling, as part of our evaluation, we do detailed stormwater modeling, which is basically a term we say for the computer program that we use to simulate these rainfall events to try to replicate what we're seeing in the field. So the watershed itself encompasses over 3,000 acres. This map here shows the full extent of the watershed. So the Weiss Road, just for reference, is right here. Staunton Road is down here. Here's Kidder Ditch. So even all of this drainage upstream, encompassing a total area of 3,000 acres, all flows towards Kidder Ditch. So we may say that the extent of our evaluation was towards the Weiss Road. Quite frankly, when we build the stormwater model, we're collecting all of that drainage from that entire 3,000 acres and conveying that runoff down to Kidder Ditch the way it does in reality. So the land use of Kidder Ditch watershed or drainage area, the land use tends to impact how much stormwater runoff gets generated from the watershed. So areas highlighted here in yellow are the agricultural land uses within the watershed. The orange area here represents the residential area. And then the green areas just represent some small areas of wooded area that remain within the watershed. So kind of a predominant mix of residential in the southern portion of the watershed, but a lot of agricultural land use on the northern end of the watershed. Impervious areas tend to be an important component when we do these evaluations from a stormwater modeling standpoint. So impervious areas are anything like rooftops, driveways, sidewalks, roads. Anytime there's new impervious areas implemented or installed, that generates more runoff because you're changing it from more of a kind of an undeveloped landscaped area to a pervious or an impervious area. And in the world of stormwater modeling and stormwater calculations, that generates more stormwater runoff. So within the drainage area of Kidder Ditch, there's about 250 acres of impervious areas throughout the whole drainage area, or about 8% of that 3,000 acres consists of impervious areas. So one of the things that we looked at as part of this evaluation is the development in the past 10 years within the Kidder Ditch watershed. So all these areas highlighted in yellow here, kind of, middle part of the drainage area, still south of all of the agricultural area, but just north of the residential area here, has been developed within the past 10 years. And this represents about 260 acres of newer development within the last 10 years. We did want to acknowledge the city does have stormwater management regulations. There is a stormwater ordinance. It's chapter 1125 of the city's ordinances, all about stormwater management. And there's very specific requirements within that ordinance that requires any sort of new development or redevelopment to manage their stormwater runoff from a water quality and a water quantity standpoint. And by water quantity, I'm kind of tying that back into those detention or retention basins where, in order to offset all of that new impervious surface that's generating more runoff, you have to implement and construct new detention basins to capture that drainage and release it basically according to what the release rates were prior to the development. So there are specific requirements in the city's ordinances that applied to those newer development areas over the last 10 years. So when we look at these areas, the number of stormwater retention or detention basins connected to those newer development areas. There's about 16 of them kind of sprinkled throughout those newer development areas. So older parts of kind of the developed area of the watershed, all of that would have been developed prior to any sort of stormwater management regulations. But since the inception and the adoption of those stormwater management requirements, anytime there's new development occurring, these types of stormwater management facilities have to be installed. So just some pictures of what these look like, kind of big retention ponds. Some of them are dry detention basins that look dry. They fill up with water during a rainfall event. They're all kind of, designed with these outlet control structures that are, specifically designed to regulate how much flow goes out of the detention facility, again, all in the context of trying to minimize the impact downstream. So as part of our evaluation from a stormwater modeling standpoint, we did break the watershed down into these 75 different subcatchments. We for each one of these subcatchments, we're incorporating how much impervious area is within that watershed. What are the runoff coefficients? How do those impact the magnitude of peak flow rates and the drainage coming from the watershed? And all of that information gets incorporated into the stormwater models that we use to simulate the flow. So some of the modeling results, and I know some of you have already started looking at some of these maps over here that we've got on the boards. So the images here in the presentation are represented over here with the maps as well. So after the presentation, we can talk through some of the specifics of these. But one of the things that we noticed as part of our evaluation, the FEMA floodplain mapping, the 100-year floodplain that FEMA has previously developed, does appear to extend well beyond kind of the reality that we've heard from the residents, either based on the survey or when we go back and look at that event back in 2014, that was well beyond a 100-year event, where there wasn't a whole lot of structural flooding. What we're seeing in our stormwater model when we run these larger events like the 100-year event, a much smaller footprint of that floodplain. So that on all of these maps that follow, this kind of lighter shaded area on the maps is the current FEMA 100-year floodplain. And the darker blue areas on these maps represent kind of where we're currently at with our stormwater modeling for a 100-year event. This isn't exact. It's not a precise science by any means, as these stormwater models are the best tools that we have to try to simulate these rainfall events to predict how high we think the water could get during these larger rainfall events. So, as we cycle through these, and again, I would welcome everyone to come over and look at the boards and we can talk through specific properties, but the general outcome when we look, and we're kind of working our way from upstream to downstream on these maps. And that's how we got them set up over here. Kind of the left side is upstream and you work your way downstream. The general conclusion that we're seeing here, initially is that the 100-year floodplain extents appear to be well beyond anything based in reality from what we've seen. So again, here, just some imagery. This is Skylark, Longwood, Mystic, Stony Ridge here. Pretty dramatic potential changes where, again, the FEMA floodplain maps show a pretty broad area within the 100-year floodplain. And according to where we're at with our stormwater models, we're showing a much smaller footprint of that. And this is kind of towards the downstream end as well. So Staunton Road would be kind of down here, just off the map. So more recently, there was a rainfall event back in March of 2021. When we looked at the rainfall data corresponding with that event, it did correlate to about a 25-year rainfall event. So as during our evaluation, we just happened to get a rainfall event that kind of registered on the scale, nowhere nearly as close to the magnitude of the event back in May of 2014, but still a pretty sizable rainfall event. A 25-year event is a fairly significant rainfall event. Looking at the pictures of that rainfall event here, and again, this is Market Street, working our way down to Stony Ridge Drive. You can see the flow is generally contained within the ditch. As you kind of look at Market Street, just upstream of Market Street, Maple Crest Drive, again, it got really close to Maple Crest Drive, but didn't overtop in that particular 25-year event. Skylark and Terry Drive, it's, and even Stony Ridge, the flow is still contained within the kind of the concrete areas bound by that ditch. So a pretty telling storm event here, where for a 25-year event, maybe we would have expected to see a little bit more flooding, but according to those photos, we just didn't see a whole lot of it. So the preliminary findings of our drainage study, primary structure flooding within the Kidder Ditch study area during extreme rainfall events appears to be limited to a few properties. So again, going back and talking through those survey results, there were a few properties that acknowledged structure flooding, but the majority of those seem to be kind of groundwater seepage issues. When the water gets up to a certain elevation in the ditch, maybe there's some basement flooding that's seeping through the groundwater, causing some issues in the basements. There may have been one or two circumstances where the water got up high enough to spill over into a window well next to the house and got into the basement. So maybe a few circumstances like that, but not a kind of broad primary structure resident flooding. The FEMA floodplain mapping appears to extend well beyond any previously documented flooding, and I say including that May of 2014 rainfall event. Again, very broad floodplain mapping done by FEMA years and years ago. And kind of the current reality that we see here is that the limits of that floodplain appear to extend well beyond anything that's been documented in the past. Maintenance activities and responsibilities within the drainage easement need to be more clearly conveyed to the residents. As part of this effort, this is kind of a public education outreach effort as well. Just making sure everyone is aware that there are drainage easements along the ditch. We're going to be working with the city to maybe develop some specific documentation of things that you could be doing within that drainage easement to keep it open so the water can be conveyed a little bit better within the ditch itself. And then enhanced maintenance and inspection activities by the city at the bridge and outfall locations should reduce potential for debris buildup, which impacts the capacity of the system. So near some of those bridges, there does tend to be a little bit of deposition of debris and sediment that gets deposited. That if the city cleans that out a little bit more frequently, that would maintain the flow a little bit better through the ditches or through the bridges. Those tend to be those critical points where the flow kind of contracts underneath the ditch. So maybe some enhanced maintenance around those. And then the storm sewer outfalls themselves. I don't know if any of you live where there's maybe a small storm sewer outfall that discharges into the ditch. Sometimes there tends to be a little bit of deposition, build up around those outfalls, and that can restrict some of the flow coming from the pipes themselves from out in the streets into the ditch. So the next steps as part of this drainage study, obtain feedback from you all on the preliminary findings. We do want to continue to get your feedback at the meeting here today after this presentation. We do want to hear your feedback too on the FEMA floodplain mapping. We can't make any guarantees based on these results that FEMA will agree to very broad floodplain mapping changes. But we feel like we're building enough evidence and supporting documentation here that we could consider going down that path of modifying the FEMA floodplain mapping based on the drainage study that we're working on. The city does intend to install a new detention basin near Finsbury Lane. Christy, I don't know if you want to chime in on the kind of the timing of that and what that's about.
City council at their last meeting just authorized the payment for that project to be done as part of the new clubhouse that is being built there on Halifax. So I would anticipate honestly within the next month that you
Thank you. And then ultimately, we plan to finalize the drainage study based on the community's feedback. So with that, we will open it up for questions. We did include Stan's contact information on the slide here for any other follow-up questions beyond the discussion here tonight. But we can either do a question and answer here now, or if we want to break off and look at the boards, John and I are available here for however long we need to answer any questions you may have. Sure.
First of all, thank you so much. Great presentation.
Thank you.
It really was educational. I do want to get Stan's phone number though, because the next time before this 1,000-year rain gets with 100-year rain, we've been there 23 years. I want to call him, have him come up, take some pictures, because we've been there. My wife and I have been there 23 years, many times, and it's come up into our yard, close, not to the house yet, many more times than you can imagine. Forget ODOT's 1,000 years. that representative come here and talk to me in 100 years. We've been there 23 years with the second house on the North Market on Stony Ridge. And believe me, we've had many times that it's come up and done some really good damage, not just with flowers and stuff, but it's come up and it's been a little scary at times.
Sure.
But I do appreciate your presentation. I hope you guys got some solutions because it's a little nerve wracking at times,
Sure.
but I appreciate it.
Sure. All right, thank you.
I live down on the other end by Carriage Drive, where it is a lot wider.
Mhm.
And back in the, I'll go 15, 16 years ago, my boy worked for the city in the summer. And the ditch back there, his boss made him weed eat that and mow all that, back here where I live. And after he graduated high school, went to college, nobody ever come back there and mowed it or weed eated it all. And today, and with this meeting today, there's a guy back there mowing it again. I thought, well, that's because they're having a meeting. We're sure and they mowed on both sides of the district. Never mowed on. I call it the county side, which is, the side of county or city, really. But it was just so funny they mowed on. And what our problem is down our end, when it mowed there, or when it back in March, when Rangers back, we've got so much debris. I mean, there were so many tree limbs. There was chairs, there was trash bags, all that kind of stuff. And it seemed to stop right there at Carriage and Rudy.
Mhm.
And then eventually, and it got mowed today and never moved some of them trash bags that was there.
Yeah.
He had this mowed right all around, kept on going. And that's the stuff that aggravates me. And
Yeah.
it's never got up to within 50 feet of my house since I've lived there. I think before I moved there, Rudy used to flood all the time there, Rudy Drive. Since then, it just, how that went on.
Yeah, I mean, from a mowing, I guess just from a stormwater perspective, when you think about the vegetation that's growing in the ditch itself, if you don't mow it and you let that get really tall and kind of unruly, when you get these rainfall events, it can restrict the flow coming through the ditch itself, as I'm sure you're aware. And the whole thing with the the debris and the garbage, again, I think as part of this, maybe a kind of a public education and outreach on what you can and can't do within that drainage easement, because it does impact everyone downstream. So if there's folks upstream that maybe aren't adhering to what some of the language in the easement says, it does impact folks downstream.
But the thing about it is, and I know there's some guys go by there every time with all those bridges along there. You can look across the bridge there and see stuff laying there. And I almost say it's the city's responsibility to take that out there, even though it might come from somebody else's yard or whatever. But it just still lays there. So go by the week, the water's down, it's still there.
Yeah.
And that doesn't help the flow of water either.
Right.
Something's restricted there. And then that guy's backyard might get up higher than across the bridge where it's, a little lower because it's been restricted. Right?
Yeah. You guys want to chime in?
If I could follow that gentleman, because he's right down the road from me, I'm
Yeah.
on Harris and Stony Ridge, he's on that road, I used to live on Ridge Drive. It's difficult to get back there and keep that clean, that brush gets very tall, the guy got stuck down there twice this morning. I even stood out there and watched him, because he was underneath the unit, and I said, as long as it's watching, he usually gets in trouble, and, because I heard something really gonna sound. But I don't know what the answer would be there on my personal property. I kind of started to develop that area to make it a little bit of a flower bed. Nothing too exotic, knowing it's gonna, most of it will be washed away. It hasn't been well maintained in the years. There's a drain there that my neighbor used to clean with this. Clean out the drain at the bottom of it, to let it go, a sewer drain inside that ditch right there. No one even knows it's probably there. But it drains it so that it doesn't it makes it dry so that it prevents mosquitoes.
Yeah.
What I did was I got rid of all that down there because I had nothing but rodent problems. Rabbits and everything else got bed in there and it just tearing up my yard. So I got rid of some of that brush. But with that gentleman that's being in March, my thought was if we had one more storm, where would it have been? Would have been real trouble in our area. I know it would have been. So no one can say that. You can, and I've done modeling in my
Yeah.
company, in my career. I understand models. You did a very nice presentation.
Thanks.
I didn't see the model, of course, but. So with that, specifically here, what I would like to maybe propose is, if we get that guy going in a dangerous situation, trying to chop down all that tall grass, can we plant, a wildflower project back there? Some natural plants that just come back. Because with that tall grass back there, the capacity is reduced by 60%.
Mhm.
Right.
We're just gonna wait till 6 feet tall before you try to build it.
Well, it's too wet and everything else, but like I'm just saying, what would be wrong with a nice wildflower? The Kidder Ditch is a wildflower paradise.
So, I mean, it is part of this, like you said, talking about how we educate you about maintaining your easement as residents, and then what extra efforts the city steps up. But I will make the point and say, like, if we look at the boards and see where the drainage easements are, you say, what's to stop somebody from planting wildflowers? Well, in every one of these cases, it is your properties.
Well,
So nothing's to stop you from planting
well, the
wildflowers.
difference, it's my property. I can walk from my backyard right down into that ditch. Nice and easily. There's no
Right.
fence. My neighbors on the side, they have a like fence there, and then they got a sharp drop off. And I would hop that fence into a weed whacker and try to clean that up.
Right.
So if there's any proposal, I talked with some neighbors that they're talking about, part of that bullet point was, we need to clean better. Well, I did mine. I can do it. I can get at it. But you're gonna hop over a fence and then go down on that steep grade? I don't think so. And that's gonna be dangerous.
Yeah.
But anyways, I concern, I like the improvement project. I also just, in all studies, you just don't know what Mother Nature's gonna throw at you. We have some close calls.
Yeah.
And all we need is one big storm, another dump, another some property damage. So, anyway,
Yep.
thank you.
Understood.
Thanks.
Yeah, I live on Scenic Court. I've been there over 30 years and I've had 5 foot of water in my backyard from a Kidder Ditch. So, yeah, I've actually fished off my deck, caught catfish back there. So, I love the presentation, by the way, but I think a couple of things that I'm kind of disappointed that haven't been addressed, and maybe they will be in the future. And number one is, we all turn on the TV and you listen to the radio, and it's always talking about climate change and this and that. And to his point, at some point in time, when you get enough of these rain events, the ground gets saturated, the water can't go anywhere. So what's going to get done about that, number one? And number two, just like the river, been there 30 years, that ditch has never been cleaned out. It's never been dragged. Sediment builds up every year. All that crap washes down, builds up, builds up. That ditch was probably behind my house 4.5 foot deep at one time, and it's probably 1.5 foot or 2 foot deep now, just because of runoff and sediment building up, and the city does nothing about that. And I think those two key issues need to be addressed. I understand the 100-year thing. I've been down this road before, but we have 100-year event like we had in March. And to his point, if we'd had a 2 or 3 inch rain in April and another 2 or 3 inch rain last week, this would all be a different story here.
Sure.
So I know you're kind of under the gun, but I think those areas, those 2 particular areas really need to be addressed. That creek needs cleaned. Everybody, that baby needs cleaned out. I mean, sediment just builds and builds and builds, and it gets shorter, right? So where's
Yeah.
the water? If the water rises, where's it gonna go?
And I think that it's a good point, because one of the limitations that we have is we're kind of coming in looking at the ditch now.
I get it.
We haven't seen that like progression of change of sediment buildup in the ditch itself over time.
1980s, Channel 7 was there, and kids were swinging out of trees into the road, high diving, and as cars were flooded, it was over the roof and everything.
Yeah.
So I've seen some major rain back there.
So So yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And that's part of the discussion we'll have with the city in terms of are there kind of bigger cleanup improvements like that? That, I mean, if you clean out the deposition and the sediment buildup, you're going to be adding conveyance capacity.
Problem, it's a costly problem. I understand, Stan's gonna have trouble with it because there's gas lines that run across Second Street underneath, there's phone lines, there's electric lines. I know there's a conglomeration of stuff. It's not gonna be a cheap fix or adventure, but I do think it's really something that should get addressed.
Okay.
That's all I'm saying. I appreciate everybody.
Okay. Thanks for the feedback. Yes, sir.
Great job putting all of our pictures. Laying it out on the map. I'm the one who lives right on 1210. Maple Crest. Bridge. We moved in 05. There were ducks in the creek was real nice. And it was kind of helpful why we bought the house. Now, it's over the years, drains are there, I could get downhill, I could mow it. Probably shouldn't have done it, but I could go into the bed of it when it dried out and mow it off. I'd be more glad to do that now. But how many years ago, put those spikes in? And it just dammed everything up. And I mentioned it in your presentation. I'm glad you're aware of that, because it just reroutes everything right out of Redmond. And it keeps that hill out. I cannot do it.
We get like 10 foot, right now, we have 10 foot planks and somebody's spouting, somebody's scratching in and it all just stays there. And, sometimes we can get out there and pick it out there, but when it's 10 foot plank, and two, we have what used to be a rolling slope down to it is now a cliff. Because it has gone around that area.
Yep.
And eaten out the sides of the can.
The last time it rained, March, I think it was that time, it brushed a bunch of stuff right up on our hill. I can't do that stuff out there. You need a digger or a pitchfork or something with some major power lines that I don't have. And it's still sitting there. And the place looks like that. And everybody used to walk by there and say, oh, boy, this is lovely. They're sitting out here watching the ducks, and now they're looking at it tonight. Now I feel guilty because it looks like that. And if I try to sell my house right now, I could count on somebody like me. Say, oh my God, that's pretty. But, it's fine in the rain that's coming up certain levels and that. But when you get the yahoos and their trucks blowing through the bridges, and then it shoves that weight right up to the slabs of the houses that are there on Maple Crest.
Yeah.
There was 2 houses on the other side of that. I don't get wet in my house because it's set up so high. But the more that hill goes away, I won't have that. But, those people were awkward because they didn't get wet, but they were darn close to it every time a truck flew through there.
Yeah.
Just having a good time. And I got plenty of pictures for you. If you want more. My name's Dunbar, and I think let's see some pictures on there.
Yeah.
Plenty more pictures. Right now, it needs to get cleaned again. And it's just, it's uncontrollable. I can't get at it.
Yeah. We appreciate the
Place to see some attention.
Yeah, I do appreciate the feedback on that. And just so you know, we have had several discussions with the city here specific to the Maple Crest Drive Bridge. So we recognize that as kind of a key point in this. So,
I'm
we'll,
aware of the easements and all that, anything we try to plant there to hold the hill is gonna be going, I know it, but we do it anyway, and try to help hold that hill, but you can get it to a point where I can at least get it mowed or something, individually, without major backhoeing, they come down there and they've got those posts and they stick their backhoe down in there and knock them through it, so they're not straight. And then the last time, they actually took a scoop right out of my hill and left all the stuff lay there. So, say it's my property, so I'm happy to go about it, but it's my responsibility too, and it upsets me because I can't get at it to do anything with it.
Yeah.
And they just make it worse every time they come down and do something. That's not a bridge, that's not a creek under there anymore, or a ditch, it's a lagoon, because they dug it out. And it just sits there, growing mosquitoes.
Yeah.
You can understand how that's gonna do.
Yeah. Yep.
Thanks, Nathan Walters at 820 Skylark. I do want to thank Strand and the city for doing this survey. It's good to get some eyes on it. I wanted to talk about two things. The first one is mowing in general. My property is on both sides of the creek. I can't get to the other side with the mower. Weed whacker, but it's like 200 feet long. This is my stretch of the ditch, just not counting the L I'm on too. I do mow my side where my house is the best I can. There's a flat portion before the concrete culvert or whatever, and I do the hill the best I can. I can't get the other side. So we've kind of talked around this about the city getting us better guidelines of what we can and can't do with the easement. And like she said, it's our property. So I'm not really scared of it, but technically if someone was upset with me, I could get in trouble for not mowing the other side because the grass is over how many ever inches long or whatever. I don't think that's going to happen to any of us, right? But we need to have a better idea of what our responsibility with the easement is. And I know this is, already talked about, and what the city's responsibility within the easement is. Do we have to mow? Do we need to take care of it? We don't all have specialized equipment to mow, a 60-degree grade or something like that, or a 45-degree grade. So when I do mow my side of the hill, it's probably a little dangerous, but I do what I do because it looks better.
Mhm.
So those are the things that's one thing I wanted to talk about is mowing in general. What are the responsibilities of each party? The second thing I wanted to mention was kids. I'm sure we've all had kids run through our yard because kids play in the ditch or the creek or whatever you want to call it. I'm not worried about kids in my yard, but maybe like some others, I do have an umbrella policy because that creek does run through my yard. And if a kid gets hurt, drowns, I'm going to get sued. And the city would too. And so I got to have that protection. So I have an umbrella policy, through my auto insurance or whatever to protect me.
Mhm.
I'm not asking the city to cover that or anything like that, but I am concerned about kids in the ditch when it's dirty. We talked about cleaning out stuff. A couple of years ago, Stan will probably remember there was a car crash there at Skylark, and there are pieces of the aluminum railing sitting in there, and kids were playing with it. So I did call the police because I thought that was a bit unsafe. But it's just something to keep in mind as we work through what to do with the creek or the ditch, whatever, going forward. This is a playground for kids too, unfortunately.
Sure.
Or fortunately, whatever. It does attract a lot of neighborhood kids riding bikes, walking. Sometimes barefoot, which whatever, but just to put that on your radar, it
Sure.
is used as a recreation area.
Specific to your property on the other side, is that the city park on the other side of the ditch over there?
It's Campbell Park there, so my property goes up the fence line, and so it's all angled. I can't, without driving around the block, I can't get a mower over there.
Sure.
And then I don't have a safe landing like I do on my side, so I wouldn't even want to try and mow that.
Yeah.
And I do thank the city for when they do come through and mow those weeds. I know that's been something they've been doing for at least the last 20 years or so. But knowing are they supposed to do just the other side, or are they supposed to do my side? Just having those responsibilities in place. What's on me, what's on the city.
Sure.
Very specific. And
Yeah.
if there needs to be questions about specific property, a method of finding those out.
Okay.
So I have a question on that.
Yes.
As the guidelines are developed, what's the best way to reach out to everyone along the ditch and help get everyone on the same page? Is it a mailer? Is it another meeting? What, a mailer?
Yeah, I mean, I respond better to email, but I know not everybody does, or text me, but mail would probably be the most universal method of getting a hold of people. A community meeting like this has been great. I made sure I was able to make it. I'm probably one of the younger folks in the room by a few years, but but this doesn't show much for it. But I'm invested in the community in many, many ways, and I do care about my immediate neighborhood in Troy.
Good comments. Thank you. Sir in the back.
So I've lived on Cloverdale for the past 27 years. And I think for the past 6, we we've been hearing off and on that this ditch was gonna get dredged out. Because upstream from me, you talked about the grade, you know, didn't really change much. The water sits until it eventually will dry out, but until you get to that point, there's mosquitoes, bugs, all that stuff. And, I mean, to everybody's point here, I pulled out a 2x6 that was probably about 10 feet long. And that was after the March rain. So that was even after the bad one earlier. So I'm just curious, is there plans to actually dredge this thing out for us?
I think that's something that, based on the feedback we're hearing tonight, we will discuss that with the city to talk about, the opportunities to do that. I mean, Christie and Stan, I don't know if you want to chime in on that or not, but I mean, it sounds like the deposition of sediment within the ditch itself has been acknowledged by several residents here tonight. That's something that needs to be further discussed as part of this.
I mean, one of the challenges is gonna be, when you look at a ditch like this, there'll be a control point at some point downstream where you've got to match grades. Like right now, this thing is relatively flat. So there's probably going to be a limit to the max slope you could reestablish to bring that ditch back to its point of discharge, right? But I'm trying to figure out, is this local deposition at a few flat locations? Or is this deposition throughout the whole thing and the whole ditch has come up, and then downstream where it ties in, there's a drop? I'm trying to get your sense from that. Is it more local deposition where there used to be a little bit more grade, and where it's flattened out, it's deposited, and just some very localized maintenance activity could reestablish that? Does anyone have a sense?
I think that's difficult for us to explain to you because we don't go back up to DeWeese Road. We don't know what that incline is as it comes down towards Fourth Market.
Yeah.
Where of course we're out of it. And then what happens after that? We really don't have the capability of judging that, except when the damn water comes out and we're in trouble. So we really don't, I don't think we can answer that for you. I just want to remind you, one follow-up, again, there are power lines and there's things underneath that. And so when you start dredging, I don't know how far you're gonna go down dredging, but there's power lines, cable lines, all sorts of lines. So I don't know how that's gonna get, we all want it done. There's no question about it. That's why we're here. And we, again, appreciate what you've done, but I don't think the answer, that's a difficult question to answer because we don't have the capabilities of knowing. Obviously, if DeWeese Road comes down, we know that. But after that, we don't know the structural.
Where the concrete is, at least, it hasn't changed, obviously.
Right.
There's a little bit, they did dredge in the fall or the spring, I forget.
Yes, they did.
Yeah, I saw some bulldozer guys go through and the backhoe pull it out, but
So
yeah, where it's just dirt though, it might be more of a concern.
So there's probably opportunities to enhance the channel in certain locations, but there are gonna be limitations where
Sure.
utilities, concrete, these are set points that
Absolutely.
are gonna limit the extent of the improvement there.
Yeah, when your fall's only a foot from
1,000
Maple
feet.
Crest and Stockton Road, a little sediment is gonna go a long way.
Yeah.
It's not gonna take much to.
Like I'm at a right angle, so I can pull the stuff down.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge problem, the Kidder ditch was fine 20 years ago. Maybe it's outlived its usefulness. Maybe the city ought to be looking in another direction, doing away with the ditch and figuring out how to run sewer lines to the river and help people along there. I don't know. I mean, I guess that's what you guys are involved in, so you will know.
Yeah.
But I just think with the climate change and everything that's going on, we're gonna see more and more rain events. We're already seeing more and more rain events. It's changed a hell of a lot in the 30 years I've lived there.
Sure.
Generally, though, I honestly, my recommendation to everyone would be you do not want to put this in a closed system. You put it in a closed system, and then that system is going to be designed for a certain condition, and whenever that condition is exceeded, you have problems. So.
Yeah, but you don't want your shed floating down the creek either with your
No, right.
lawnmower and crap in it, you know.
But an open channel system gives a lot of flexibility depending on the storm events that are occurring for the system to fluctuate, the water surface to fluctuate and then come back. So.
Yeah. And I'm good with that. I'm hoping that's what this study's gonna.
Yeah.
The net result's gonna be, you brainiacs figuring this out.
Thank you. I think you had a question here.
I appreciate the city mowing mine. I live on Longwood. Several years ago, they made it wider, deeper, and cement bottom. But on my side on Longwood, it's steep and I cannot mow it, I can't get down Weed Whacker either.
Mm.
But I appreciate the city mowing it. And they do it about 3 times a year. In fact, it's about time for them to do it again. right?
Yeah, I was thinking that, it's getting kind of long.
Yeah, because I can't do it. My neighbors across the creek do somewhat, but they only go so far too. But
Sure.
still, I do appreciate the city mowing that for us. It does help.
Yep, go ahead.
I don't phone the mowers. We've lived there 45 years. I'm on Cloverdale and the ditch is behind me. And we were told when we bought that property, that we were to take care of it. Well, at that time, we had like a cliff. It was neat. You couldn't mow it, but we kept it up with the weed whacker and everything. Okay, so we take care of ours. They take care of theirs. We're neighbors. But other people must not have been told that, or they don't respect it because they don't take care of it. Therefore, the water comes down and then it stops and it's eroded our property away, our yard. Instead of having a 4-foot area from the back of our shed to the ditch, now we've got maybe 2, maybe. So I'm gonna lose my barn too.
We already lost our ramp. To the river.
Yeah, it's just unbelievable. You can almost walk across it on our yard
Mhm.
where it goes out. And it's just kind of discouraging.
I moved in at 14, but no one explicitly told me what I had to do. I found out through hearsay and
I don't think anybody told anybody around.
And now it's probably my responsibility to find out the easements that are on my property, but who
Sure.
does that?
Sure.
They just told us.
Sure.
we bought it.
Question, between Maple Crest Bridge and Market Street, MetroNet,
Mhm.
we've now got yellow and red flags growing in our backyard. If I understand correctly, that's kind of like hydro drilling out there, but they would have to go under the ditch, don't they? And if so, is there some type of clearance that they have to do, or is a problem starting that if we drew it down, it would be fixable before it's a problem?
Do we know when they're planning to install that?
We'll need to look into that, John. I wasn't aware that they were going in that area, but we can look into that and see what their plans are, depth wise and.
So typically when MetroNet is boring, right, that they're boring in where you guys, where you're on gas lines, other utilities, MetroNet is following along in those same easements. MetroNet's the new internet provider in town. And so I say boring work isn't consistent, but in general, MetroNet will tell you that they're boring at least 3 feet deep.
They
It's
told
a
me
statement
they
they
were
just
gonna
made.
run a secret line over at Dave's house, so I could see what's going on.
Yeah, go ahead.
In kind of reference to your deposition statement or request that you had before, we've got storm sewers right there between us, come from both Cloverdale and Stony Ridge. And on any kind of a rain more than a ½ inch, those storm sewers develop a swirl that just erodes the property. So that creates then sediment downstream somewhat, and that, and to Rich's point, where we don't have a good flow anymore because we have standing water areas. If you look at those storm sewer areas, that might be a good place to indicate where that deposition is occurring. So just something like that.
Yeah, thank you. Good feedback.
Yeah, I mean, the current industry standard now for storm sewer outfalls, I mean, normally you would have some sort of stone or riprap at the outfall to prevent that scour.
Did it stay? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a follow-up to John's question here a while ago about stagnant water in the ditch. I know, and I think I mentioned it earlier when I spoke, but I just want to remind everybody that there is a drain right there just past the bridge. And my neighbor, he's no longer with us, he used to go down there once in a while, he would clean it. He'd go down there and dig away on that grate, and he was so proud of that. And through the years, I don't, you know, I can't even see it anymore. I saw a laptop computer down there the other day, and a guitar and some other junk, but that I believe that was designed so when it's, because it is so flat, that once the water would stop flowing down that drain would eventually let the water go, but now it's just a bog.
Hmm.
You know,
So what does the drain look like?
just standard storm drain.
Yeah.
It's great. It's about, I don't know, 4 by 6. If that, something like that, but it's right there past the bridge. It's on the 799 Stony Bridge side.
Okay.
And we used to clean, I used to go and help once in a while.
Okay.
But it's, but that, I think that was the idea, to get the stagnant water out of there, but that thing hasn't been.
Yeah.
I think it's been 15 years, probably. So,
We may be able to track down the old drawings for that.
so I don't even know how many more drains are there. But that only helps you with the stagnant water issue, not the surface. I mean, I'll just say again, there's been many times I have thought, one more big rain, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
I'm in my shed's gonna be in trouble, I'm gonna have water in my yard, you know, it's gonna be interesting. As far as damage, it was like, I've had lots of water in my yard.
Yeah. Yeah.
But,
So one thing you could do for us is get with one of us after this and let's locate your property and let's see if our model is projecting the water surface location on your property. If you could do that, that would be helpful for us.
That drain is a low flow, like a field tile
Mhm.
that was put in when the city rebuilt the ditch from the river up to Stony Ridge, and then later took it up to the fork with DeWeese and the Kidder. But the pipe he's talking about stops at Stony Ridge, I believe. I don't think it went further.
Okay.
Because once you get out of the bridge, out past the wall section, that pipe was laid at the side, one side, I think it was west side of the ditch.
Just a small drain tile next to the ditch.
And the idea was to try to help dewater the ditch.
Hmm.
That's 25 years,
Sure.
30 years worth of siltation problem.
Sure.
That gradation thing there, Maple Crest is definitely a stopping point for all that to come down to. And I don't know if you have other points along the way, that are so blatantly obvious, you know, whoever knows of any of those spaces, that might be the points to concentrate on. Because I feel like if you would just go back to grade in that area there by that bridge, and you get those posts out of the way that dam it up when the stuff comes. Because that might help some of that flow go back through there. Because it always did before, and I know this is a one time in many years, but they didn't have that kind of problem before that. And I'd at least like to see them go back to something like that.
Sure.
Without having to dig deep, just get it back to like where it was.
Yeah.
And I'm Terry, you can throw it back on the hill, and then I can help you out. All the time.
Yeah.
I appreciate, and I'll get back to you in a second. I appreciate all the comments. One thing I haven't heard anybody touch upon, and I do want to make sure we get your input on it, is the floodplain. Like, is there an interest in the city going back and trying to get the floodplain maps revised? I don't know.
Yes.
So I do, see there are some properties, and we can make sure everybody, we go and look at the map where your property is. There are a few properties that are not currently shown in the floodplain, and it's just a few, but it's shown would be added into it, the way this model shows. But and I think it only affects maybe 2 or 3 properties. Pardon?
You price flood insurance?
Flood insurance is not.
I hired a private surveyor
Yeah.
and I had my property removed from FEMA and the flood service. I had a politician who I will not mention. So this will be very difficult because politically speaking, they want the revenue. They like the money. FEMA wants that money.
Well, to pay for all the
Bottom line.
beaches and stuff, all those
Yeah.
high price houses.
I'm gonna add this, I was told when I bought my home and every time they sold my mortgage, it mattered whether I had flood insurance or not. I kept challenging it. And, so it just went back and forth all the time. And so you never know.
It's worth getting it removed. I mean, it saved me thousands of insurance dollars.
Sure.
I mean, you know.
I have a question about mowing or not mowing. Several years ago, we received a letter from the city stating that we should let our grass by the ditch grow higher, a little higher, so it will help retain the moisture, the rainfall. Yeah, control the runoff. So I thought, well, yeah, because we used to always mow all the ditch, so we let our grass by the ditch grow higher. We'll admit right now it's too high. So what's the balance? Do we mow, not mow? What do we do?
Take that.
That's
an interesting question. You know, we shall learn.
So there's two ways to look at this, and if it's just grass, one of the things that you really want to make sure in an open channel system is you want the banks to be as stable as possible. Because during those high flows, you're going to have erosive velocities, right?
And we've had erosion.
Right. So, this is always the balance between trying to maximize your capacity, but also trying to stabilize the earth and banks. So ideally, you'll have a reasonable slope on the bank and you will allow vegetation. And if you can get deep-rooted vegetation, that's probably the best. So allowing your grass to grow up a little bit, have some height to it right along the bank is not a bad thing. But you probably see golf courses, right? They tend to mow right down to the edge of their ponds. You also always see erosion on ponds, and that's just sort of from wave fluctuation, right? So leaving a little height in your vegetation is good. The thing we don't want on this system is a lot of woody debris that is going to die and then fall into the channel, because then we get the situation like you're seeing, right? It's building up and causing blockages. So my advice to this in a perfect world, and it's going to be kind of site specific, would want to try to lay back banks a little bit to get a reasonable slope to them, get them vegetated, maintain that vegetation, but avoid a lot of heavy woody debris on the banks or vegetation.
Thank you.
To address your point of the change from the flood maps, that's just from my experience from the time I've been here. I think your models seem to be pretty accurate, and they do encompass the few gentlemen here who talk about having water. I mean, he's not saying that nobody's gonna get water on their property. We're just talking about moving the flood maps to a more realistic, more realistic place. And I think their models do show that from what I've seen happen during the 2014 event. And you still have an option to get flood insurance if you want to buy it, but it would not force all those people in these areas that aren't surely affected to do that and do the challenges with the decent properties.
Sure.
If you go mortgage your house today, you're gonna get it because you're gonna get a mortgage without it. So it's in the floodplain. FEMA will make sure it's.
Well, that's what I think needs to be changed when we're talking about.
I agree. That's why I spent $1,000 to have my house removed.
Yeah.
There's a ditch down there off of Stone Road, let's say where Maple Crest comes out. That ditch used to flood out. It's not part of the Kidder ditch. And I say they put stone down on the side of that to keep from that erosion. And I'm not, someone like this guy here, talk about that. You put that on it to help it out, but who pays for that cost? I guess we do, so we can keep our backyards from eroding. But I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. This where Maple Crest comes, there's a ditch, there's a farmer right there by where the house that's way down in there.
Down in the valley.
Yeah. Okay, they put stone down along the side there, and it's really helped that ditch where it wouldn't erode. I know it's not part of the Kidder ditch, but that might be something that we look at, but that's gonna cost money for my property, pretty decent, but some of these guys that's got their areas where the water's just eating that bank up. At least that would help slow it down, in my opinion. I don't know if that's really rain goes, it looks like that, they're pretty good.
That's true. Sometimes, depending on the flow channel characteristics, sometimes you need the heavy stones because the erosion is just more than grass.
Heavy stone, of course, now this is big rock, I mean, this is,
Oh, it's
you know,
good size.
2-3 inch rock, yeah, you know, like I said, it goes property, but yet also could say your, you know, your erosion up, you know.
Yeah, it's basically onward the back.
Right, yeah.
Particularly, you'll see the highest velocity outside the bed of the stream like that. That's where they need a little more advanced structural protection required. Just throwing rock in there, I don't know if anyone has tried that. There's a science to that. We need to make sure that this, I can't tell you how many times we've seen people, they will literally put a sign on their property. You know, Phil wanted, like, just dumping stuff every
something
year.
like that.
dumping it. That stuff's just gonna wash away. That's temporary. So if you're gonna do that, you really need to make sure that you know how to place that rock, you know, the right size of rock based on stream velocity, shear stress, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. You go on Stone Road, you'll see it's like 2 inches thick and it's, you know, foot, you know, you'll get different sizes.
Right.
You know, that's, do that.
I don't know, I'm just throwing out there, but the deal with the way the town is. We want to preserve that bridge along that ditch as much as we can, and it's all the road. We looked at all kinds of things to put on that hill to keep it from eroding. I mean, we looked at crown vetch and rescue and all kinds of stuff that you don't want invading, but nothing would hold on that hill. I don't know if maybe you have ideas of what we can do on those hills that will hold those hills, and is there a way of rebuilding those without cementing them? Or
Yes,
stoning them?
yes.
And I mean, we're not allowed to like bring in a truckload, of milk up there, you know. You know, somehow it'd be nice to come up with that kind of stamp where we could save or rebuild those, because all my neighbors are talking about their erosion too over the last 15, 20 years. But if there was a way of trying to reclaim that natural boundary that's not so natural anymore, and then, you know, help us figure out what we can do on this. That would be helpful, I think.
Well, all I'll say is there are a lot of ways to use vegetation to stabilize the slopes. Let us take this information back, look at things in a little more detail, some specific locations, and maybe come back to the city with some recommendations. But and this thing, I'm biased with this, but my personal preference would be trying to avoid just throwing concrete everywhere to preserve areas. There are better ways to do it.
Who or what is the killer that's named after? Okay. Always wondered that. Nice.
We like to call it correct because it's fish in it, right, Dad? We fish in it, so we call it correct, sorry. We don't like the term yes because we fish, we used to fish it. Wonder River back there.
Just to maybe put a pin in to help some of the people that are still paying for flood insurance. I don't have a mortgage, so I just did all the money I saved in my, built my house right now. But when I was going through the ordeal I explained before, I lost my train of thought, I apologize. But I was told by the city, and this was a long time ago, but, you know, it's a long time ago. And in the end, they said, well, if you can call the Army Corps of Engineers, maybe they might come out and study it. And I says, well, I really just think you'd have more as a city employee with the Army Corps of Engineers. Like, who would I contact? And they're gonna come out to my house and redo my map. And somebody else said they redid theirs, so they had the map. I have my old map when I bought my house. You know, but it was just kind of interesting. So just to put a pin in it, yes, they need help to change the map.
Yeah. All right, well.
So we really want to thank you for coming. I mean, we'll, for all those of you that want to stay around, staff, Strand, we'll leave with you. We want to talk through some things on the boards, but we'll keep moving forward. We appreciate all the input. I am so pleased that so many of you showed up. When we come to a public meeting, we never know how many people will come, and always for any project that the city is doing, more input we can get from our residents and property owners, the better.
something